The dust of Texas swirled around the disoriented POW mother as she watched her children, three small faces she had protected through years of war, taken from her. The mother stood in frozen silence, her heart heavy with fear and disbelief. These weren't the soldiers she'd been warned about. These weren't the torturers and killers from her nightmares. These were American cowboys, their faces soft, their hands gentle, yet they were pulling her children away, and she had no power to stop them. All the lessons of honor, shame, and loyalty that had been drilled into her mind told her that her children would suffer now, subjected to a cruelty she could barely comprehend. But what happened in the following days would shatter every belief she had been taught. These cowboys, these men she had been taught to hate, would do something unimaginable. They would show kindness, and in doing so, reveal a truth far more unsettling than cruelty. Her world would never be the same. She stood frozen, terrified and uncertain, knowing that every moment of this brutal war had led to this point, her children being taken from her. The cowboys, their faces inscrutable, moved silently, unaware of the war raging in the mother's heart. But what happened in the following days would shatter every belief she had been taught. These cowboys, these men she had been taught to hate, would do something unimaginable. They would show kindness, and, in doing so, reveal a truth far more unsettling than cruelty. Her world would never be the same. The truck jolted to a halt, and the POWs were ushered out onto the vast, barren land of the Texas ranch. It was unlike anything the mother had imagined, anything she had been taught to expect. In her mind, she had envisioned a hellscape, a brutal military prison where they would be punished for their surrender. But what lay before her was almost peaceful. The ranch stretched endlessly into the horizon, the grass waving gently in the warm wind. Not a single gunshot, not a shout, not a snarl of rage. It was silent, too silent. Her surroundings were so clean and open, they felt foreign, like something out of a forgotten dream. In the distance she could see horses grazing, cattle slowly meandering across the fields, and the faint sound of a banjo playing somewhere off to the side. As they were herded off the truck and onto the dirt, the mother could barely keep her balance. The journey had taken its toll on her, leaving her weak, malnourished, and aching all over. She was exhausted, both in body and spirit. The women and children around her were in a similar state, their faces hollow with hunger, their bodies as thin as reeds. They had all been prepared for worse. They had been told that to surrender meant disgrace, that captivity meant brutality. But none of them had been prepared for this. None of them had expected to be treated as human beings. The first shock hit when her children were taken from her. They were separated without a word, without the brutal force she had imagined. A pair of American soldiers, their uniforms neatly pressed, moved toward her children with an air of indifference that cut deeper than any violence ever could. They took the children gently but firmly. The mother's heart lurched in her chest as they were pulled away from her. Her little girl clung to her, not understanding, but the soldiers pulled her away with a soft word, their faces unreadable. Her son, too, was taken, each of them slipping out of her grasp one by one. She wanted to scream, to fight, to tell them they couldn't have her children, but her voice faltered in her throat. She was too weak, too lost in the swirl of confusion. "Please," she whispered, though she barely recognized her own voice. Her words hung in the air, unheard, as the soldiers continued their silent work. She reached out instinctively, her hand trembling, but a soldier placed a firm hand on her arm. His eyes were kind but distant. The expression on his face was one she could not understand, an odd mix of curiosity and care. They were taking her children, and yet they weren't treating them as the subhuman enemy she had been taught to believe they were. The mother's chest tightened as she watched them disappear into the distance. Her mind screamed for her to run after them, to fight, but her body refused to obey. She was powerless in this new world, lost in the silent void of her grief. As she stood there, paralyzed by the loss of her children, another soldier stepped forward. He wasn't like the others, his face softer, his expression less stern. He didn't shout or command. Instead, he gave her a look of understanding, as if he could see the pain reflected in her eyes. His voice was low and measured when he spoke. "Are you all right?" The mother could only nod, too dazed to form a response. The soldier stepped back, his expression not one of cruelty, but of something else, something she had not expected, a kind of sympathy. She couldn't comprehend it. How could these men, these enemy soldiers, be anything but the ruthless killers she had been taught to fear? As she was led away to a holding area, her thoughts raced. She wanted to feel anger, to hate them, to refuse to accept what was happening. But the reality before her was so far removed from the horrors she had envisioned that it left her numb. The POWs around her moved in a haze, as if they, too, were struggling to make sense of it all. The mother's grief for her children was raw, but now there was something else, the unsettling seed of confusion. If this was captivity, what had the war truly been about? The mother's mind drifted back to her village in Japan, a quiet place nestled in the hills, untouched by the brutality of the war, until it wasn't. The rice fields had once been green and fertile, filled with the sounds of children laughing and the scent of fresh earth after a rainstorm. Now the village lay in ruins, its fields barren, its homes shattered. The winds carried the smell of burning wood and metal, a constant reminder of the war that had consumed her country. She could still remember the days before the bombings, when the world felt safe, when the future seemed full of promise. Those memories seemed as distant now as the last time she had seen her husband, who had left for the front and never returned. But war had no mercy for the innocent, and it had no mercy for the weak. The sounds of destruction were all too familiar. Air raids that rattled the earth beneath her feet, the scream of sirens that sent her children scrambling for shelter, the constant fear that gripped. Her heart was suffocating. At times it felt like the very air was poisoned with tension and uncertainty. There had been days when food was scarce, and her children had cried for the rice they could not eat. She had learned to ration, to stretch every meal as far as it would go. They had lived on the remnants of their once plentiful world, fighting hunger every day, scraping by on what little they could salvage. In those moments she could feel her body betraying her, her ribs too sharp against her skin, her stomach hollow, aching with a hunger so deep it gnawed at her soul. She had watched her children grow thinner with each passing day. Every time they cried for food, it was like a knife to her heart. She had no answers to give them, no promises to make. All she could do was hold them, comfort them with lies, and tell them to endure. But the lies were beginning to weigh heavy on her. There was no end in sight, no salvation to offer. Her thoughts often returned to the belief that surrender was worse than death. The words of her commanding officers were burned into her memory. To surrender is to dishonor the emperor. To live under the enemy's flag is worse than dying. These words had been drilled into her since she was a young girl, a member of the loyal imperial forces. They had taught her that honor was everything, that the Japanese soldier's duty was to die for the emperor, to defend the sacred land of Japan with every ounce of strength. She had heard stories of the soldiers who had died without flinching, whose bodies had been left behind, scattered across foreign soil. Her own training had been harsh, lessons in discipline, in endurance, in sacrifice. She had been taught that survival was a test of strength, and weakness was a betrayal. As a mother, her heart had rebelled against these ideas, but she knew the cost of failure. To surrender meant disgrace, and the disgrace would not only fall on her but on her children as well. She had promised herself she would never allow that to happen. Her children would not know dishonor. She would protect them from it at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The nightmarish thoughts of surrender had consumed her as the war dragged on. She had seen the devastation wrought by the enemy, the bombs that had fallen, the cities reduced to rubble. The belief that they were the enemy, the evil invaders, was deeply ingrained in her. The propaganda had made sure of it. The stories of American soldiers as barbarians who tortured and killed civilians, who desecrated the sacred soil of Japan, had taken root in her heart. She had feared them. She had been prepared for the worst when the Americans came, prepared for the humiliation, the violence, the stripping away of her dignity. Her children had been taken from her, but they had not been torn from her in the way she had feared. They had not been subjected to cruelty or abuse. They were alive, they were safe, and they were cared for by the very people she had been taught to despise. This simple truth began to gnaw at her, stirring a deep conflict inside her heart. She wanted to reject it, to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. In this moment, surrounded by the quiet stillness of the ranch, the pain of her situation began to give way to something else, a subtle, uncomfortable shift in her heart. The love she had for her children had always been a driving force, but now the weight of that love was beginning to evolve. It was no longer just about protecting them from the horrors of war. It was about understanding what kind of world they would grow up in, a world that seemed to have been turned upside down by the very people she had been taught to fear. 2 days had passed since her children were taken from her, and the world seemed to shift around her. She had not seen them since that moment when they were gently, almost tenderly, led away by the American soldiers. Her grief had become a numb ache, and with that ache, an unsettling curiosity began to grow. What were they doing to her children? Were they safe? The images of them, confused but not harmed, lingered in her mind. It was a strange comfort, but one she was not yet ready to embrace fully. In the silence of the camp, amidst the long hours of waiting, a strange thought grew. Perhaps this was not the hell she had feared. Maybe, just maybe, the enemy was not the monsters she had been taught to believe in. It was late in the afternoon when the soldier came. She was sitting on a haystack, staring out at the expanse of land that stretched beyond the wire fence, when a shadow fell across her. The man was young, barely older than the boys she had seen training back home, and his eyes were not filled with malice, but with something she could not quite place. He held a bowl in his hand, steam rising from it in a quiet promise of warmth. She looked up at him, her stomach tightening instinctively, but she did not speak. He did not speak either. He simply held the bowl out to her, the motion slow, almost hesitant. The mother's first instinct was to refuse, to turn away, to throw the bowl back at him and scream for the return of her children. But her body, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, betrayed her. Her eyes dropped to the bowl, and the rich, earthy smell of the stew wafted up to her nose. It was unlike anything she had smelled in weeks. It smelled like real food, thick broth, vegetables, and meat. Her mouth watered despite the fear that clutched at her chest. She hadn't had a full meal in so long. Her stomach clenched painfully, aching for something to fill it, but there was another feeling, something deeper, that made her hesitate. This was the enemy. These were the men who had torn her children away from her, who had come to destroy her world. How could she trust them? How could she trust their kindness? The mother's hands trembled as she took the bowl. The warmth of it seeped through her fingers, and for a moment she forgot where she was. She forgot the barbed wire, the soldiers, the uncertainty of what would happen to her children. She was just a woman holding a bowl of food, a woman who had not felt warmth like this in months. Her breath caught in her throat as she brought the bowl to her lips. The food smelled rich, almost too rich, a far cry from the thin rice and watery soup she had been surviving on for so long. Her mind screamed at her to resist, to reject this, to remain loyal to the cause. But her body betrayed her again, and she took a hesitant sip. The warmth spread through her chest like a balm, and her body responded instinctively. The stew was thick, flavorful, meat, vegetables, salt. Everything she had been denied for so long. She drank it slowly, savoring the sensation of warmth filling her empty stomach. It wasn't just sustenance, it was a symbol of something else, something deeper, a kindness that, in that moment, made her question everything she had ever known. How could they do this? How could they, the enemy, offer her this simple act of compassion? The bitterness in her throat was not from the food, it was from the realization that the world she had known, the world she had fought for, had been built on lies. As she finished the stew, she placed the empty bowl on the ground and looked up at the soldier. He had not moved, his expression still unreadable. She didn't know what to say, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The soldier simply nodded, as if this small act of kindness were nothing more than a routine. Yet for her, it was everything. It shattered her beliefs, her understanding of who the enemy was, and in its place was a quiet confusion. If this was not cruelty, then what had she been fighting for? What had all of it been for? The inner conflict that had been brewing in her mind since her children were taken now raged with full force. Should she trust this? Should she trust these men who had shown her kindness in the face of everything she had been taught to believe? Her mind screamed for answers, but the answers weren't coming. Instead, she sat in the stillness, the quiet of the camp surrounding her, feeling the warmth of the stew settle in her body, the warmth of the sun on her skin, and the weight of a world that no longer made sense. The hunger had been satisfied, but the question of what came next, of who she was, of what her future held, remained unanswered. Days passed, but the ache in her chest never eased. It was as though the absence of her children was a physical wound, one that throbbed incessantly, no matter how much she tried to focus on anything else. They were gone. Her children, her flesh and blood, had been taken from her, and there was no telling when or if she would ever see them again. The silence of the camp became unbearable. In the stillness of the night she would sometimes wake, her mind flooded with images of them, her daughter's small hands, her son's frightened eyes, and the ache in her heart would swell. But in the daylight, when the camp came alive with activity, she found herself watching everything around her with a strange, desperate intensity. She observed the other prisoners, their faces lined with exhaustion, their bodies bent under the weight of captivity. And she watched the soldiers, too, these men who had torn her children from her, who had stripped her of her sense of security and place in the world. At first, she had expected nothing but cruelty from them. She had been prepared to hate them, to despise every movement they made, every word they spoke. But the more she watched, the more she began to see something else. The soldiers were not what she had imagined. They were not monsters. They were not the torturers, the killers she had been told to fear. They were human. The soft exchanges between them, the small acts of kindness they showed to the prisoners, were too numerous to ignore. She saw one soldier handing a piece of bread to a woman who had not eaten in days. his expression not of superiority, but of quiet concern. Another soldier gently pulled a man from the ground when he stumbled, his hand steady, his voice low and calming. These moments were small, so small they might have been dismissed by someone else, but to the mother they were revelations. As she sat there, watching them go about their daily tasks, a seed of doubt began to take root in her mind. Was this captivity so different from what she had imagined? The thought troubled her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. She had been taught to see these men as nothing more than instruments of death, as tools of an enemy that sought to destroy everything she had known. But the more she observed them, the more she saw that they were just men. They had families. They had lives outside of this camp. They, too, had been caught in the web of war, fighting for a cause they believed in, just as she had once believed in hers. She had assumed that her enemies were evil, that they were somehow less human than she was. But now she was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. These men were no different from the soldiers she had once fought beside. And then there was the question of her children. She had been told they would be taken away, that they would suffer unimaginable horrors, that they would never know kindness again. But what if the soldiers, these men, were taking care of them? What if they were feeding them, clothing them, treating them with a basic decency that she had never thought possible? The thought was almost too much for her to bear. How could she live with herself if she allowed herself to believe that the soldiers, her captors, might be treating her children with more compassion than she had ever shown them? The doubt continued to grow, feeding on her fear and her longing for her children. Could this captivity be different? Could it be a kind of captivity that didn't destroy the soul? The days passed in a blur. The mother continued to sit watching the camp, the soldiers, the prisoners. Her mind was in turmoil, torn between the grief of her children's absence and the growing realization that everything she had been taught might be wrong. Could she trust the soldiers? Could she trust this new reality? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that, in the absence of her children, she was slowly beginning to see a different kind of truth, one she was not ready to confront. The soldiers were not the monsters she had been led to believe they were, and that made everything even more complicated. It was the morning of the third day when she was called. The voice that spoke her name was low and distant, and she didn't fully understand it at first, her mind still swimming in confusion. But the command was clear enough. She had been summoned to the barn. The moment the words reached her, her heart seized. The barn. Her mind immediately went to the worst possible scenario. It had to be something terrible. Perhaps her children had been brought there for some form of punishment, their disobedience or weakness becoming the excuse to make an example of them. Her steps were slow as she made her way to the barn, her heart hammering with every footfall. Her mind raced with countless thoughts of what could be happening inside. What had they done to her children? Was this the final proof of the cruelty she had feared? She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She was ready to fight back, to stand in the way of whatever horror awaited her. She had been prepared to endure any suffering. But her children, they had to be safe. She could not let them face this nightmare alone. When she finally reached the barn, the sound of laughter broke through her thoughts. Laughter. It was so unexpected, so jarring, that she stopped in her tracks. It wasn't the forced, mocking laughter she had anticipated. It was the carefree, innocent laughter of children. She blinked, her mind struggling to reconcile the sound with the grim picture she had painted in her mind. She stepped forward, the barn door creaking as she pushed it open. Inside, her children were playing. They were sitting in a circle, their faces lit up with joy, their small hands moving eagerly to join in the games. Her daughter was laughing, a wide smile stretching across her face, her cheeks flushed with life. Her son was holding a toy, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. They were clean, cleaner than she had ever seen them in months. Their clothes were fresh, their hair combed neatly. It was the most startling contrast to everything she had imagined. Her children were not suffering. They were not crying, trembling in fear, or begging for release. They were happy. They were safe. For a moment, the mother stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, her breath caught in her throat. The scene before her was unimaginable. The Cowboys, these men who had taken her children, were sitting with them, not as captors, but as companions. They weren't standing over her children with guns drawn, ready to strike. They were watching with genuine interest, not mocking them, but sharing in their joy. One cowboy was even helping her son with a puzzle, pointing to pieces with a smile. The other, a younger man, was kneeling beside her daughter, showing her how to tie a knot with a piece of string. The tenderness in their actions, the care with which they handled her children, struck her like a blow. The mother felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, tilting in ways she couldn't control. Her children, who should have been broken, who should have been trembling in the face of their captors, were thriving. And it was the Americans, her enemies, who were making this possible. How could this be happening? This wasn't the nightmare she had feared. This wasn't the brutality she had imagined. The soldiers, the cowboys, they were not monsters. They were men. Human beings who had shown her children kindness when she had expected cruelty. She stepped into the barn, her feet heavy, her heart pounding. The children looked up at her, their faces bright with recognition, their smiles widening. Her daughter reached out, her arms open wide, as if nothing had changed. The mother's heart twisted in her chest. She wanted to reach out, to hold them, to take them away from this place and return to the world she had once known. But she didn't. She couldn't. The kindness in the room, the gentleness of the cowboys, held her in place. She had come expecting to reclaim her children, but now she wasn't sure what to take them back to. The seed of doubt, once small, had taken root deep within her. This was not the war she had been promised. And as she stood there, torn between her love for her children and the confusion that swirled around her, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, the mother found herself navigating a strange new reality, one that she never could have imagined in her worst nightmares or her best hopes. The camp, once a symbol of everything she feared, had become a place of quiet moments and surprising transformations. She had expected punishment, degradation, but instead she was met with simple acts of kindness that pierced through the armor she had built over the years. It started with small things, things she never thought she would be grateful for: a blanket, a meal, a chance to bathe. These were the kinds of things that before she would have taken for granted, never knowing how deeply they could affect a person's soul. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, the mother found herself sitting on the edge of a wooden bench. She had been summoned to the mess hall for dinner, her stomach still tight from the memory of the food she had been offered earlier. This end time. The warmth of the stew was different. It wasn't just nourishment, it was something deeper. The meal was accompanied by the soft murmur of voices, the clinking of metal trays, and the shuffle of boots on the dirt. The soldiers were not standing guard over her with cold eyes, but were simply going about their duties, ensuring everyone had what they needed. The simplicity of it, the quiet, almost domestic rhythm of the camp, felt so foreign to her that it made her head spin. The next morning she was given the opportunity to bathe. The idea of it felt almost surreal. She had not had the luxury of real water since the war began, only rationed sips, the occasional cold splash to wash her face. But here, in this strange camp, they were offering her warmth. She stepped into the small wooden building where the shower was set up, the steam rising in thick clouds around her. It wasn't much, just a small stall with a thin trickle of water, but to her it was as though she had been given the entire world. As she stood beneath the warm flow, washing away the grime of war, the memories of the camps she had feared, the bombings, the cold, all seemed to fade into the background. She was no longer a soldier, no longer a captive. She was simply a woman, taking a moment to cleanse herself. The simple act of receiving care, of being treated with dignity, was transforming. The longer she stayed in the camp, the more she realized that these small acts were not just about physical survival, but emotional healing. Each moment of kindness chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. She had come here expecting to die slowly, to be humiliated and broken. But instead, she found herself starting to live again, starting to heal. It was almost as if the captors had become the caretakers of something deeper within her, something she had lost long ago, her humanity. As days turned into weeks, the mother's internal struggle continued, but now there was something new in her heart, a flicker of hope. She had always thought that survival was about enduring the worst, about outlasting the pain. But now she was beginning to see that survival was also about acceptance, about understanding that the world could still hold moments of tenderness, even in the darkest places. The soldiers were not the monsters she had been taught to fear, but men who, despite the horrors of war, still had the capacity for simple acts of kindness. And those acts, however small, were healing her in ways she hadn't expected. With each new day, she found herself questioning the world she had left behind. Could this captivity be different? Could it be a form of survival that didn't require her to lose everything? The emotional wounds she had carried with her for so long, wounds of fear, of distrust, of the overwhelming grief of losing her children, were slowly beginning to heal, not through grand gestures, but through these quiet, unexpected moments. The truth, as it began to settle in her heart, was simple and yet profound. Survival was not only about enduring the physical horrors of captivity, but about rediscovering the humanity she had lost. And in the midst of this war, surrounded by the men who were once her enemies, she was beginning to find that humanity once more. The mother sat in the corner of the barracks, the air thick with the scent of straw and dust, as the soldier approached her with a piece of paper and a pencil. The moment felt surreal. Just days ago, she had been on the verge of despair, unsure if she would survive the next hour, let alone the next day. Now, she was being offered something she hadn't thought she would ever see again, the chance to communicate with her family. A letter, a message back home. The reality of it was almost overwhelming. How could she explain everything she had seen? How could she put into words the complex emotions that had taken root in her heart? How could she write about the unexpected kindness, the warmth that had been shown to her, when her family had been fed nothing but lies about the brutality of the Americans? Her family had believed, as she had once believed, that surrender meant death, that captivity would be the ultimate dishonor, that the enemy was merciless. How could she, a mother who had been raised to honor her country above all else, write the truth? When the truth had begun to erode everything she had once known? Finally, after what seemed like hours of hesitation, her hand moved. The words came slowly, carefully, as though she were stepping through a fog. Her writing was small, neat, constrained by the gravity of the moment. She wrote, I am alive. They treat me with care. I do not understand this war anymore. It was simple. It was brief. But it was the truth, the only truth she could write. Her mind spun as she wrote, each word weighing heavily on her heart. The feeling of the pencil against the paper was foreign, a reminder of the world she had lost. She couldn't remember the last time she had written anything other than a military report or a letter to her children, and yet here she was, writing a letter that held the power to change everything. Her family would read these words, and they would have no way of understanding what she had seen, what she had felt. The ideological walls they had all built would be impossible to scale, and yet here she was, trying to scale them with nothing more than a few sentences. The act of writing was cathartic, but it was also a quiet rebellion. Every word she wrote felt like a tear in the fabric of her old beliefs. The mother had been taught to view the world in black and white, honor versus dishonor, loyalty versus betrayal. But now the lines were blurring, and the weight of that change was pressing down on her chest. She could feel the shift in herself, the transformation that was slowly taking place. She was no longer just a soldier, a mother clinging to the remnants of a lost world. She was becoming something else, someone who had seen the humanity in her captors and had come to understand that the world was not as simple as she had been taught. As she finished the letter, she sat back and stared at it, her thoughts swirling. She had written the truth. But could she truly accept it? Could she accept that survival, for her and her children, was no longer about fighting, but about letting go of the old world and embracing something new? She wasn't sure. But in that moment, she knew one thing with certainty. She could no longer ignore the humanity in the men around her, no matter how hard it was to accept. She folded the letter carefully, the weight of it sitting heavy in her hands. She was no longer just writing to her family. She was writing to herself, to the person she used to be, and to the person she was becoming. And as she handed the letter to the soldier, the truth settled into her chest, quiet but undeniable. The war she had fought was over, but the war inside her was just beginning. Days continued to pass in the camp, each one blending into the next with an almost dreamlike quality. The mother found herself caught in a strange, suspended moment, as though the world outside the camp no longer existed. She had once thought of survival as a battle of strength, of fighting to the end, of holding on to her beliefs no matter the cost. But now, with each passing day, she found herself questioning everything she had been taught. The things she had once held dear, honor, duty, loyalty to the emperor, were beginning to feel like distant echoes of a world that no longer made sense. The kindness she had seen from the soldiers, from the cowboys who had cared for her children, gnawed at her conscience. These were the same men she had been taught to despise. They had been cast as monsters in her mind, their faces twisted by propaganda, their actions painted with the brush-strokes of cruelty and violence. She had been told that surrender was dishonorable, that captivity meant disgrace, that the enemy would strip her of everything she had ever known, but what she had experienced in the camp didn't align with any of that. The soldiers were not monsters. They were men, men who had offered her care when she had expected nothing but torment. How could this be? How could the very people she had been raised to hate, the very enemy she had been taught to fear, show her such unexpected kindness? As the days wore on, the mother began to feel a deepening moral conflict within her. Her beliefs, her sense of honor, were starting to crumble beneath the weight of her new reality. She had been raised to believe that to fight for the emperor was the highest calling, that loyalty to her country and her people was worth any sacrifice. She had been taught that to surrender was to abandon all that she held dear, to disgrace herself and her family. But now, as she saw the soldiers care for the prisoners, as she saw her children laughing and playing under their watchful eyes, the foundations of her honor were shaking. She felt a growing resentment toward the propaganda that had shaped her life. She had been fed lies, manipulated into believing that her enemies were less than human, that their motives were driven by malice. But now, with each passing day, she saw the truth for what it was. The Americans were not monsters. They were people, just like her. They had their own stories, their own struggles, their own pain. They were not the caricatures she had been taught to hate. They were flesh and blood. And in their quiet, unexpected kindness, she saw a reflection of her own humanity. The weight of these new questions pressed down on her. How could she reconcile this with everything she had known? How could she reconcile the kindness she had witnessed with the idea of duty, of loyalty, of honor? The foundation of her beliefs was crumbling, and she didn't know how to rebuild it. The very things that had once given her strength, her unwavering loyalty, her devotion to her country, her sense of duty to the emperor, were now becoming chains that held her to a past she could no longer accept. And yet, as she sat in the quiet of the camp, watching the soldiers go about their tasks, a new understanding began to form within her. Honor was not just about blind loyalty. It was not about sacrificing everything for a cause that no longer made sense. Honor, she realized, was about the ability to recognize humanity, even in those you were taught to despise. It was about seeing the person in front of you, not the enemy. And in that realization, she began to understand that survival, true survival, was not just about physical endurance. It was about emotional transformation. It was about learning to see the world with new eyes, eyes that could recognize kindness, even in the most unlikely of places. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The days that followed felt like a quiet awakening. The mother, who had once been a symbol of unwavering duty to her country, was now a woman in the throes of transformation. She could feel the change, slow and steady, beneath the surface of her every action. At first it was subtle, small shifts in how she viewed the world around her. The fear that had once gripped her heart, the fear of these soldiers who had taken her children, had begun to fade. The emotional distance that once separated her from them, the gulf between captor and captive, had slowly started to shrink. She had spent so much time trying to resist the kindness they showed her, as though accepting it would somehow betray everything she had ever believed. But with each passing day, the wall she had built around her heart began to erode. She found herself engaging more with the soldiers, not as enemies, but as people. Small conversations, fleeting moments of connection, where they shared brief glimpses of their own lives. She began to realize that these soldiers, who she had been taught to fear and despise, were not so different from herself. They had their own stories, their own losses, their own battles to fight. They, too, had been shaped by the war, just as she had. One evening, as she sat by the campfire, the warmth of the flames brushing against her skin, she found herself talking to one of the cowboys who had been particularly kind to her children. He was sitting nearby, cleaning his rifle, his expression calm and thoughtful. She had never spoken to him much before, her mind always too preoccupied with fear and suspicion. But now, for the first time, she felt an urge to reach out, to connect, to understand. "I never thought this is how it would be," she said quietly, her voice hesitant, almost as if she were speaking to herself more than him. He glanced up from his rifle, meeting her eyes. There was no judgment in his gaze, no suspicion, just a quiet recognition of something unspoken between them. "None of us did," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his own experiences. But here we are." Her heart ached as the words settled into her chest. The simplicity of them, the honesty, struck her deeply. It was the first time in so long that she had heard something other than orders or propaganda, something that acknowledged the painful reality of their situation. It was not about the war, it was about survival. And survival, she realized, meant embracing the humanity in each other, even in the most unexpected places. As the days turned into weeks, the mother's worldview shifted quietly but powerfully. The stark divisions between her and the soldiers began to blur. She began to see the world not in terms of enemies and allies, but in terms of people. People who had been scarred by the same war, people who were trying to rebuild, trying to find a way to move forward. Her heart, once hardened by grief and fear, began to soften. She began to understand that survival was not just about clinging to the past, to the values and beliefs that had once defined her. It was about adapting, about seeing the world through new eyes, eyes that could recognize the potential for kindness and compassion in places she had once believed were devoid of both. The change was not immediate. It did not happen in one moment or with one conversation. But over time, it became undeniable. The mother had been transformed. She was no longer just a prisoner of war. She was a woman who had learned to see the humanity in those around her, even in her captors. And in doing so, she had redefined what it meant to survive, what it meant to honor the past, and what it meant to be truly free. The day of repatriation came like an unexpected wave. The mother stood with her children, who were now a little stronger, a little more resilient, their faces filled with a quiet sense of calm. It was strange, this final moment. She had prepared herself for so many things, for the worst, for more pain and suffering, but she had never truly imagined that she would be leaving the camp not with bitterness, but with a heavy, quiet understanding. The cowboys, who had once seemed like distant figures of her enemies, now felt like something else entirely. Human beings who had shown them compassion, even in the darkest of times. As they boarded the ship, the mother's gaze lingered on the shore, her heart pulling her attention back to the camp she had been so sure she would leave behind in anger and sorrow. She had come to this place expecting cruelty, fear, and humiliation, but instead she was leaving with a deep sense of gratitude and mourning. She looked back at the cowboys, some of them standing at the docks, watching the ship slowly pull away. There was no animosity, no anger in their eyes. There was a quiet understanding that hung between them, a shared recognition that something profound had happened in that place, a transformation of people, of hearts. She couldn't name it, but she felt it deep inside her. They were not enemies anymore. They were people who had become part of her story, who had shown her a side of humanity she never expected. One cowboy, the one who had taught her daughter how to tie a knot, waved to them as the ship moved further out. The gesture was simple, unadorned by ceremony or fanfare, but it struck the mother like a lightning bolt. He wasn't just saying goodbye to a prisoner, he was acknowledging that she was a person, a human being. The truth of it washed over her. These men, once the symbols of everything she had been taught to hate, had shown her kindness, had treated her and her children like people rather than enemies, and in doing so they had forced her to reconsider everything she had ever known about war, about loyalty, and about honor. Her hand drifted to her pocket, where the letter she had written to her family rested, folded neatly and carefully. The letter was no longer just words on paper. It was a symbol of the journey she had undertaken. It had been the first time she had truly confronted the dissonance between what she had been taught and the truth of her own experiences. She had written the truth, simple and raw. I am alive. They treat me with care. I do not understand this war anymore. It was a letter of reckoning, a quiet reflection of the emotional and moral shift that had taken place within her. As the ship moved further into the distance, the mother felt a strange calm settle over her. She would be going home, back to a world that had not changed in the time she had been away, but she had changed. The person who had left her home, so sure of her duty, so certain of her cause, was no longer the same. She had come to understand that survival was not just about clinging to life, but about adapting, about seeing humanity in places she had once believed to be void of it. The kindness she had encountered had shifted her perspective forever. She no longer saw the world in black and white. It was now full of nuances, of contradictions, and of unexpected moments of grace. When she returned to her homeland, she knew that the world she had left behind would be the same, filled with the scars of war, filled with people who still believed in the old ideas of honor and loyalty. But she also knew that her own journey had led her to something new. She had discovered that even in the darkest moments of conflict, there were sparks of humanity, of kindness, that could not be extinguished, and that knowledge would remain with her, shaping the way she would live the rest of her life. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering this piece of history.